After defining an application in the Password Manager Access Suite console, the next step is to configure a password policy. Define a password policy so that I can control this application's policy. I can change the password every so many days. I can make sure the password has so many numeric characters, special characters, that the user changes the password every so often, etc. So that's what I've got to do. I've got to go down to the Access Suite console here. I've got an application definition for Logon Tester. The password policies node came with a couple policies. There's the a default policy in here. There's also a domain policy, but neither of those necessarily what I want for my Logon Tester. So I'm going to go with a brand new password policy. Now I get to create this here. Of course, passwords policy is enforced by that third-party application. There may be a requirement on that application that it change the password every 40 days, that it have a minimum of 10 characters, that it always include numeric characters, and always include at least 2 special characters, and never an asterisk. Let's say those are the rules that I got from the application vendor. Well, I've got to meet or exceed those requirements with my password policy. I am creating this password policy, of course, with a particular application in mind. However, this policy is in no way tied to that application by default. I'll be creating a user so that he uses a certain application and then say he uses a certain policy with that application. So maybe for purposes of my own use of documentation, I'll name this policy the Logon Tester password policy. But in no way is this tied to Logon Tester until I create a user and say he uses Logon Tester app definition with this particular policy. So I'm on creating my password policy, and there turns out there's a lot of power I have with this. I can say these are all the defaults. I can change this anywhere I need. Again, I have to meet or exceed the requirements of Logon Tester application. Allow uppercase and lowercase characters. Do not even allow alphabetic characters. Minimum password length, maximum password length. Number of times a single character can be repeated, number of times it can be repeated sequentially, and here's where I can check that the new password has to be unique. It can't be the same as the previous password. This would help me meet typical Active Directory complexity requirements. Allow numeric passwords, and again there's a whole definition of whether I allow numeric passwords. If I do, can they begin? Can they end with numeric? What's the minimum number? What's the maximum number of numeric password characters? And then as far as special characters, if I don't want to allow asterisks in this particular password policy, this is where that's removed. And if I have a minimum of 3 wildcard or special characters in this policy, that's where that would be done. Allow users to reveal passwords for this particular application, and this is an override. This is a setting I can do in user settings, but this is an override for this application policy. Number of logon retries, also in the policy, number of times they can log in before I decide that's not the user. Use the password expiration settings. I can decide number of days until a password expires, number of days to warn user before the password expires. That might be a lot of warnings, kind of annoy a user. And as far as having password change requests, if and when there's a password change request, number one, I would have had to define that change button and the old password, the new password, and the confirm new password button if I were going to try to do something like system generated password changes. If I'm going to let the user do it, I didn't have to define all that stuff. User is going to be prompted for action by default. If I want to completely take over from the user, have the passwords changed, every 2 days, which is 256 characters, full of wildcards if I want, then maybe system generated and silent might be the way to go with that. Again, that was the default. So I've got this policy, all those abilities inside the policy to configure. I'd probably have to document what I just did and have thought about it a lot. Now I've got an application definition and a password policy for that application, but again, these are in no way tied together at this point. The next step is I'm going to create some identity verification phrases. I'm going to be configuring users, and it's actually finally the user that ties this all together.